Good afternoon, my friends. My name is Meng, and I'm a generic Googler. It's, it's a delight for us to have Dr. David Levy to talk to us about not having time to think. David earned his PhD in computer science in Stanford University. It's a small trade school down the street from here, in 1979, before most of us were born. And then a funny thing happened on his way to his next career. He had a diploma in calligraphy and bookbinding from Roehampton Institute in London, which is kind of funny for me because before I met David, I didn't know that bookbinding was something you had to learn. I thought you just put paper and staplers together or something, but no. Anyway, for more than 15 years, David was a researcher at the Xerox PARC, where his work centered on exploring the transition from paper to plastic, no, from paper to print to digital media. As a professor in the University of Washington Information School since 2000, he has focused on bringing mindfulness training and other contemplative practices to address the problems of information overload and acceleration. And during the year 2005 and up to 2006, he was the holder of the Papa Kakamaku Chair in Education and Technology at the Library of Congress. And this is where Google is better than the Library of Congress because we don't make people hold a chair for a whole year. We are nice. Anyway, my friends, I give you David Levy.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I really want to thank Meng for inviting me. Only my second time here on the Google campus. I'm here to talk about a topic that probably needs no introduction. Does anybody not know what this talk is about? No time to think? Does that register with some of you? Presumably that's why you're here. This is a concern that has been growing for me and has only gotten worse in the 6 or 7 years that I've been an academic. Because what I have found is that the acceleration that the culture is experiencing is affecting, I think, in a profound ways, even the way we are educated and the way we learn. And it's been, after 15 to 20 years as a researcher at Xerox PARC, a think tank, it was really very stunning and terribly upsetting to me to become an academic and to find that I had less time to think than ever before. The place I want to start is with a quote. This is a few years ago. I was reading the biography of Barbara McClintock, who won a Nobel Prize for genetics. A wonderful biography by Evelyn Fox Keller called A Feeling for the Organism. And in that book, Fox Keller asks the question, what enabled Barbara McClintock to see further and deeper into genetics than other people had before? It took a decade or more for her colleagues to begin to understand what she had understood, what she had seen, and to finally win the Nobel Prize. And the answer that Fox Keller gives is that Barbara McClintock took the time to look and to hear what the material had to say to her. That she took the time to be deeply connected to what happened to be the corn plants that she was studying. And there was this one story at the end of the book where McClintock goes to Harvard to give a lecture. And she explains to the students that these budding geneticists, it's really going to be important for them to take the time to look and to think. And then the students say, where does one get the time to look and to think? The students argued that the new technology of molecular biology is self-propelling. It doesn't leave time. There's always the next experiment, the next sequencing to do. The pace of current research seems to preclude such a contemplative stance. I was really struck by that because this is a story from 25 years ago. And if there is that sense of the driving quality of the technology 25 years ago, and not enough time to look, to listen, to think, well, then what would McClintock think were she to be alive today? Now, the way I want to go into this is to start with by looking at one particular very famous article from Computer and Information Science. How many of you know the article As We May Think by Vannevar Bush? Okay, so some of you do. This is Vannevar Bush, first of all, who lived from 1890 to 1974, was very famous in his day. He was trained as an electrical engineer. He was the vice president of MIT. His main research was in analog computing before digital computing was really invented. But the way he became famous was that he was President Roosevelt's science advisor during World War II, and he was responsible for creating something called the Office of Scientific Research and Development, which was the attempt to bring scientists, military people, and academics together to solve problems that needed to be solved in order to win World War II. And he was so famous that he appeared on the cover of Time magazine in 1943. This is not what he's remembered for. What he is most remembered for today, especially amongst techies like us, is a seminal article that he wrote in the Atlantic Monthly in July 1945. The article was called As We May Think. And the reason this article is so famous is that he imagined what we now call hypertext. And here are some of the central quotes from this very famous paper. He says, "Consider a future device for individual use, which is a sort of mechanized private file and library, a device in which an individual stores all his books, records, and communications, and which is mechanized so that it may be consulted with exceeding speed and flexibility." This is before digital computers are anything but, giant walls of switches. And he's actually imagining something like this being produced out of microfilm. And what you see to the left is an artist's rendition of what Bush was imagining, which he called the Memex. But then he goes on to say, this device permits associative indexing, the basic idea of which is a provision whereby any item may be caused at will to select immediately and automatically another. This is the essential feature of the Memex. The process of tying two items together is the important thing. So there it is, right? That's the moment, July 1945, when, if you like, conceptually, the link and hypertext are born. And all of the people who have been famous in this evolution of hypertext all the way up to Tim Berners-Lee and the web acknowledge that this is the seminal place where these ideas began for the technical community. So this is very well known, especially of people who were born, who are older than Meng is, let's say. What is not so well known, and the part that I want to concentrate on from this article, because I think it tells us a lot about the situation that we find ourselves today. What's not noticed so much is exactly the larger argument that Vannevar Bush was trying to make. Why did he suggest the creation of this device he called the Memex? And his argument goes essentially like this. He's writing in July 1945, the war is coming to an end. He says, a devastating war is coming to an end in which science and technology have allowed people to deploy cruel weapons against one another. And he knows all about this because he and his organization helped develop some of these cruel weapons. The survival of the human race depends on its ability to, quote, grow in the wisdom of race experience. That's a kind of archaic term, but basically he's saying our survival will depend on our developing wisdom. If people had better access to the record of human achievement, they would be better able to review their shady past and analyze more completely and objectively their present problems. In other words, he's saying if we could make better use of the human record, we ought to be able to survive as a race by developing wisdom because we have the time to think seriously about the really hard and important problems. That's his argument. It's an argument about the importance of deep and targeted thinking. But then he goes on to point out that there are certain obstacles that today meaning 1945, are preventing people from making the best use of the record. And here's what he says. He says there's a growing mountain of research, but there is increased evidence that we are being bogged down today as specialization extends. The investigator is staggered by the findings and conclusions of thousands of other workers, conclusions to which he cannot find time to grasp, much less to remember as they appear. Yet specialization becomes increasingly necessary for progress, and the effort to bridge between disciplines is correspondingly superficial. So in 1945, he's identifying information overload and the specialization of disciplines as a central problem that's going to get in the way of using the human record for human prospering, survival, and the growth of wisdom. And that's why he wants to create the memex. What he's saying is that if we had better tools, we ought to be able to automate the more routine aspects of research. And this would free people up to develop, to engage in more creative thought. It's a beautiful idea. He distinguishes two kinds of thought. One kind, he says, is kind of rote and repetitive and routine. And another kind is mature or creative. And he says, for mature thought, there is no mechanical substitute. But creative thought and essentially repetitive thought are very different things. For the latter, there are and may be powerful mechanical aids. I mean, look, here we are looking back more than 60 years later, and we can recognize, the world that you are so deeply connected with and working on here at Google, which is the realization that we can automate and semi-automate many things in very powerful ways. But this is Bush's claim, there's still room for the human mind and for a different kind of thinking, which he calls mature or creative. So here's the question that this talk is meant to pose. What happened? We have this visionary work, which in some sense has direct influence on the development of hypertext, on the development of the web, and yet the sense of information overload has only grown in our culture, and it's clear that we have less time to think than ever before. So what happened? What happened to this beautiful vision, which has so far only partly been realized? And what can we do about it? And that's what I want to spend the rest of the time in this talk talking about. And the way I want to move on is I want to contrast some of what Bush was saying with another thinker who was writing at almost exactly the same time as Bush, and who is not as nearly as famous as Vannevar Bush. And this is a man named Joseph Pieper, who was born in 1904 and died in 1997, who was German. So he was on the other side of the war. He was a Catholic philosopher and theologian. So Bush was an engineer and an American, and Pieper was a German theologian and philosopher. And in 1947, so 2 years later, after Bush's paper, which of course Pieper wouldn't have known about at all because it wasn't part of his world, 2 years later, Pieper wrote a little book called Leisure, the Basis of Culture, which is still in print. And he starts off by saying, Bush is actually, when he writes in 1945, the part I didn't tell you is he starts off by saying, what are scientists going to do now that the war is coming to an end? We've used all this scientific thinking and manpower to help win the war. But what kinds of peaceful ends should science and technology devote itself to? And that's what he then goes on to talk about. Human flourishing, the better management of the record, more time to think, and so on. In a curious way, Pieper is making a related argument because he says, what should Germany do now that we've been defeated and after all of the huge moral lapses of the war? The question is, what should Germany devote itself to? He can see that Germany is in the middle of a giant reconstructive effort where people are working very, very hard to economically reconstruct a country that has been destroyed as a result of the war. And his answer is, people need leisure, which sounds totally weird. So let's look at his argument here. He says, first of all, the world of work is becoming our entire world. It threatens to engulf us completely, and the demands of the world of work become greater and greater till at last they make a total claim upon the whole of human nature. So he's worried that Germany, in this frenzy to reconstruct itself, is going to devote itself to work and nothing but work. And then he asks, will it ever be possible to keep or reclaim some room for leisure from the forces of total work? And this would mean not merely a little portion of rest on Sunday, but rather a whole preserve of true unconfined humanity, a space of freedom, of true learning, of attunement to the world as a whole. In other words, will it be possible to keep the human being from becoming a complete functionary, a worker? So he's worrying that all work and no play makes Jack and Jill a dull boy and girl, right? And he's really worrying that without this notion of leisure, which I haven't explained to you what he means by it, that without this, that people are going to end up becoming less human, less fully human. And then he goes on to say what he means by leisure. By leisure, he doesn't mean, go watching a Giants game or playing a round of golf or playing video games. Not that he necessarily would have been against any of those things. But he says leisure is a form of stillness. That is the necessary preparation for accepting reality. Only the person who is still can hear. Only the person who is still can hear. And whoever is not still cannot hear. Leisure is the disposition of receptive understanding, of contemplative beholding, and immersion in the real. The notion of leisure that he is using here goes all the way back to the Greek philosophers. It's leisure as quieting and stilling the mind, becoming receptively available to the world rather than charging around and trying to do things to the world. And I suspect that every one of us has some leisure-like activity in our world. For some people it's reading, for some people it's gardening, for some people it's cycling. If we have time at the end, I'm sure some of you can tell the rest what you actually do that has this other quality, which is that it brings you to a greater sense of well-being and mental stability and opens you up to the world. And without this, you can't hear, right? You're so busy imposing things on the world that you can't actually hear. Incidentally, Pieper points out that, at least in English, the words school, scholar, and scholarship all come from the Latin schola, which comes from the Greek word, which means leisure in the sense. In other words, school and scholarship are contemplative activities in which one learns to engage with the materials. And then he goes on to say, and this is where he really, in a very interesting way, connects up with Vannevar Bush, because he also wants to talk about the nature of thinking. And he points out that the medieval scholastics distinguished between the intellect as ratio, that's a Latin word, and the intellect as intellectus. Ratio is the power of discursive thought, of searching and researching, abstracting, refining, and concluding. Let me say that again. Ratio is the power of discursive thought, of searching and researching, abstracting, refining, and concluding. It's that use of the mind to do that kind of thing, whereas intellectus refers to the ability of simply looking, to which the truth presents itself as a landscape presents itself to the eye. This has some very interesting similarity to what Bush is saying. Ratio is the more connect the dots, balance your checkbook, solve a problem that's in some sense easily solved by going from A to B to C. Bush calls that repetitive and routine. Intellectus is the more creative form of thinking, which you can't make happen, but you can quiet down enough to allow things to arise in the mind. And so here's at least the punchline for the first part of this talk. It looks to me like the web and all this amazing suite of digital technologies that we've created to date are the best tools for ratio the world has ever known. For searching and researching, abstracting, refining, and concluding. And you know what I mean, because you're right here at the center of the revolution. What happened to intellectus? While we're so busy moving, Googling and clicking and assembling and all of that, what has happened to what was both Bush's and Pieper's idea, that as we move forward out of World War II, trying to solve the larger world problems, where is the space and time in which to get quiet enough to think in deeper ways? Okay, So now I'm going to try to tell you, to suggest to you at least, how it is that I think some of this has come about, that we've lost sight of one half of the equation of thinking. It's such a simple truism of our lives today that everything is accelerating. You know, we've had books like James Glick's "Faster: The Acceleration of Just About Everything." You know, Google faster, and you'll find plenty of this stuff. What historians and social scientists, though, have pointed out that this acceleration that we're experiencing today is not new, that it's been going on for the last couple of hundred years. As this particular quote says, the general sense of a speed up has accompanied modern society at least since the middle of the 18th century. Basically, with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, beginning in the early 19th century, what you have is a new set of technologies. You have steam power that allows the entire economic system to speed up. Once you can mechanize things with steam power, you can speed up the mining of raw materials. You can speed up the manufacturing of goods, the Industrial Revolution, of course. You can speed up the distribution of goods to other places through railroads and steamboats and all of that. So the serious acceleration begins with a new set of technologies. What I've become aware of is that there have been certain periodic points over this last 150 years where there have been crises of acceleration before. Ours is not the first crisis, if you like, of acceleration. One of them happened in the late 19th century. What happened there was that by that point, the railroads were in existence. You know, serious manufacturing, industrial manufacturing was happening. People began to realize that they didn't have the management structures and skills to keep up with the rate at which things were being produced, and to keep up with distributed organizations. If you think about it, the railroads were one of the first large-scale distributed organizations. How do you coordinate across all the different railroad stations and so on? And so there's a crisis. What Benninger has called a control crisis in the late 19th century, where people start freaking out and saying, we don't know what to do because we can't manage things at the speed at which they're happening. And out of that crisis is born the modern corporation. The idea of hierarchies of job descriptions, of new document technologies like the typewriter and hanging vertical files, and carbon paper, things that, of course, are now legacy technologies that we think were the killer apps, if you like, of the late 19th and early 20th century. You also get the development of new genres of documents like memos and executive summaries and charts and tables, so that somebody sitting at the top of the organization can actually monitor and try to control what's going on. So out of that first crisis in the late 19th century, we get the modern corporation, and which we still have with us. Something interesting then happens in the 1920s. It's possible to manufacture more goods and to move them faster. And by the 1920s, industry leaders begin to realize that they're able to produce more goods than people actually want or need. What are you going to do? Right? I don't want to buy another refrigerator. I don't want to buy another car, and all of that. And so, what's the point of going faster and faster and producing more and more if it's not going to be bought? If you look at the literature of those days, what you see is a discussion, a dialogue going on among industry leaders, where one side is arguing, well, let's slow down. People don't want all this stuff. We'll just, we'll crank the factories slower. However, the other side says, no, of course, we got to figure out how to move more goods and services, right? And that's when they figure out that you ought to be able to stimulate people to buy more. And that is the rise of advertising. Modern advertising begins in the 20s as a way to keep the economic engine moving faster and faster. Today, I think we're in another crisis, which I have called an information environmental crisis, and I'll explain more about that in a few minutes, where I think once again we're at a kind of critical point where it's beginning to look like, how much faster can we really go? How much faster can we go as organizations? How much more can we take as individuals? How much do people want and need? And of course, this next crisis is being precipitated by the brilliance of the work that started with people like Vannevar Bush and continues on with all of you. We know only too well that digital information can be manufactured very quickly. It can be sent around at the speed of light. And we can use email and all kinds of other digital technologies as control mechanisms. So we have the possibility of doing more faster than ever before. And the question is that what we want to do? And is it going to work? The problem that I think we're beginning to notice, and I'm here, this is a quote from a Norwegian anthropologist named Thomas Eriksson, who wrote a book called The Tyranny of the Moment in 2001. We're beginning to notice a distinction between fast time activities and slow time activities. He says, when fast and slow time meet, fast time wins. This is why one never gets the important things done, because there is always something else one has to do first. Naturally, we'll always tend to do the most urgent tasks first. In this way, the slow and long-term activities lose out. In an age when the distinctions between work and leisure are being erased, and efficiency seems to be the only value in economics, politics, and research, this is really bad news for things like thorough, far-sighted work, play, and long-term love relationships. It's also really bad news for thinking, because thinking is a slow time activity. That's what Bush was trying to say. You can only speed up aspects of it. Thinking is a slow time activity. You can't speed up its creative aspects. You have to be receptive and available for them to arise. And Vannevar Bush, when he thought he had the solution, couldn't foresee. He couldn't foresee an awful lot of what's happened. He couldn't foresee that digital information would explode the way it has. And he couldn't foresee that we as a culture would be spending more of our times metaphorically Googling, if you like, and less of our time actually creating the space and time in which to reflect. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the nature of thinking. I've argued so far that we have a kind of distinction between routine, ratio-like thinking and more mature, intellectus thinking. This understanding is thousands of years old, and it's something that scientists and artists and writers have known, as you can see from some of these quotes. Here's Barbara McClintock, the geneticist. When you suddenly see the problem, something happens to you, something happens that you have the answer before you're able to put it into words. It's all done subconsciously. Something's cooking. Or here's the mathematician Gauss, who reported solving a theorem not by dint of painful effort, but so to speak by the grace of God. As a sudden flash of light, the enigma was solved. Or the composer Tchaikovsky, who described how the germ of a future composition comes suddenly and unexpectedly and takes root with extraordinary force and rapidity. And even Lewis Carroll talks about how when he was writing Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, that they're made up almost wholly of bits and scraps, single ideas which came of themselves. We all know the experience of being in the shower or the equivalent, and suddenly something arises. And what I'm trying to suggest to you, which is stuff that I know you know because you're all thinkers, is that that our best thinking is a mixture of ratio and intellectus. We need both, and we need to be able to put in the time to think things through, but then we hit a point where that kind of linear thinking isn't gonna work, and then we have to let go and open up for something else to arise. There is another kind of thinking, though, that we all are quite familiar with, which goes by various names and sometimes called mind chatter. I remember the first time that I really noticed my own mind chatter. I was in my 20s. I had woken up in the middle of the night, to go to the bathroom or get a drink of water or something like that, and I heard my mind going. It was going, no, and then this happened and that, and what about, it's like, what is that? And it made me wonder if that's part of what was happening in my sleep, was, blah, 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 blah. Does anybody not know what I'm talking about here? Mind chatter? So there is another mode that the mind operates in. And for most of us, it's going it's going right on the boundary between conscious and unconscious life. And sometimes it takes a kind of attempt to quiet down and focus, which is one of the things one does in meditation, to really begin to notice how much of your cycles are being stolen by this kind of mind chatter. So the larger point then is that thinking takes time. Creative thought can't be rushed. But although creative thought can't be rushed, it can be nurtured. There are ways that we can learn to quiet the mind, to tune it, so that we can become more focused, so that we can reduce mind chatter, and so that we can be available to those subconscious processes that are where some of the deepest ideas actually come from. We can't make creative thought happen, in other words, but we can prepare the ground. And the question is, where in our culture are we creating the ground? Where are the opportunities at the moment for us to actually engage, to return to this kind of creative activity? It's one of the things that, as I said at the beginning, that has been driving me crazy about being an academic, is that I feel that I am just going from, multitasking, email to meetings to, you know what it's like, and it's very, very hard, except for this year when I have a sabbatical. It's very hard to sink down into these deeper reflective processes. Okay, so as I move toward bringing these remarks to a close, I want to offer you a way that I've been thinking of framing the current crisis, which is as a kind of information environmentalism. We all know that the environmental movement is about 40 years old now. It began with Rachel Carson's famous book, Silent Spring. Thank you. And for 40 years now, a huge amount of work has been done that's finally got us to the point where we realize the extent of the crisis and the fact that we have to do something about it. But right at the beginning, 40 years ago, was the dawn of the understanding that unchecked urbanization and industrialization were hurting the planet. And the argument began to be made, well, that there are other kinds of spaces, environmental spaces, that have to be preserved for the health of the planet, like marshlands and old-growth forests and healthy oceans and so on. Today, I'm suggesting we may be at the beginning of a parallel understanding and movement as we come to understand that information overload, media saturation, the claims that ruminative and mindless thinking are taking on us is potentially of a real crisis proportion, and that we need then we may need to discover the kinds of spaces. Instead of marshlands and old-growth forests, maybe we need silence. Maybe we need forms of sanctuary. Maybe we need opportunities for creative reflection and engagement that would parallel this earlier movement. And if this is a useful metaphor, then we might think about the kinds of activities that have been involved in the last 40 years in the environmental movement. Research, what is the nature of the problem? How widespread is it? How much of the polar caps are actually melting? Public debate. Even today the debate goes on among some people. How serious is global warming? Is it human-made? Education and consciousness raising. Kids learn in elementary school. They go out and look at their local ecosystem, and they do recycling. Legislation and policy setting, technology development, changes in social practice like recycling. These have all been part of what it's taken us over these last 40 years to get to where we are today, where we still know we have a major problem, but at least more of the world is taking it seriously. And so is it possible, I'm suggesting, that we are at the beginning of a similar set of activities? How serious is this crisis of thinking and overload? How do we get it up to the level of public debate? What are the consequences of it for productivity and creativity? Look at some of the legislation, like the don't call lists, as an example of something that had largely solved one particular targeted problem, which was the telemarketing over dinner. Spam legislation hasn't done the same, but then we have our spam filters. What else do we have to do if we're going to honor the vision that Vannevar Bush had for us? So I'm going to suggest 4 directions. I'm almost done. I have another 5 or 6 slides. I'm going to suggest 4 directions for research and social activism. The first one, which almost sounds like, that may not sound like it's an activity, but I really believe it is that we simply need to become more aware of the nature and the extent of the problem. We need to take it seriously. I mean, that's been part of the problem that we've faced collectively with regard to global warming. At some point, we have to say it's more than just something I talk about around the water cooler. I'm so busy, I don't have enough time to do this and that. This wonderful billboard, I took this picture driving up 19th Avenue in San Francisco between 10 and 15 years ago. I thought it was such an amazing ad that I lived in Palo Alto at the time, that the next day I drove back up just to take this picture. It's an ad for KGO radio, and it says, "Don't drive around empty-headed." And it shows this guy with the top of his head off. And I think what it's trying to suggest is you don't want to be empty-headed, so fill up your head with sports and news and weather and all of that. And I use this just as an example of the messages that we're getting from the larger culture, which are profound. Don't be empty-headed. Don't quiet down. Keep going. To the extent that we can begin to see how powerful these messages are and begin to realize that maybe they need to be moderated in various ways, I think we'll be on our way to doing something about it. Something else that I think we can work on is to design physical environments that are contemplative in various ways. I haven't seen enough of the Google campus, but you have some lovely spaces here already. And I know from discussion with Meng that there's the possibility of creating some new kinds. There is something about being in a quiet, beautiful environment that has the tendency to bring us back to a more grounded, calmer position, and that I think encourages our ability to think and to be more ourselves. This is an ad that appeared in the New York Times magazine 3 or 4 years ago, and it's for an IBM ThinkPad ad, IBM ThinkPad computer. And it says, "In deep halcyon repose," and then it gives the dictionary definition of halcyon as peaceful. And if you look at what this ad is suggesting, it's clear that you can take your laptop anywhere, but you might want to take it to a place like the stacks of the library, which is one of those places where traditionally people have found a sense of peace and repose. So advertisers, of course, are onto some of this stuff. But there's plenty of room for us to think about how to change our physical environments in order to be more creative and more effective. Not only should we be able to think about our physical environments, we should be able to think about our virtual environments as well. I mean, in a way, the opening page of Google is actually uncluttered. That's a very interesting statement, right? But most of our computer activities, where the screen is filled and it's trying to catch our attention from all kinds of directions, what would it look like to create not just sanctuaries from cyberspace, but sanctuaries in cyberspace? That's a whole topic that has really not been approached yet. This is the beautiful reading room at the Library of Congress. Meng mentioned that I was the holder. I held a chair. I held a chair for an entire year at the Library of Congress. I would go into the reading room, which was just steps from my office, pretty much every day. And all I had to do was to walk into that beautiful room. And I felt myself relax. I felt myself be more relaxed and more alive and more connected. So I would go in there to work and to read. But one of the things that I realized about the reading room is that visually it's very busy. It's got this magnificent dome. It's got sculpture. It's got inscriptions all over the place. And yet, at the same time, it's quiet. It's emotionally and intellectually quiet. There's got to be a secret there, because maybe we don't have to. Maybe we can have visually busy environments, provided we understand how to make them calm and how they can help ground us. So there's a secret there, and I just wanted you to see this. I mean, many of us have these Bose headphones. I have a pair. Look at the copy ad, the ad copy. Use it as a concert hall or a sanctuary. They're trying to say something there, right? They're calling to us to recover this. And how do we get that in our physical environments? How do we get it in our virtual environments? The last thing I want to talk about is related to those is there's the potential to design contemplative information practices. How could we do email, or for that matter, instant messaging, or pick your favorite online activity? How could we do those in more contemplative ways? Well, I did an experiment. I taught a course at the University of Washington. I created a course called Information and Contemplation. And by the way, the syllabus is online, should you be interested. And I gave students the following assignment. I said, I want you to keep a log of your email behavior for a week. But because we were already meditating, we were spending part of each class paying attention to our breath and the thoughts that were going through our minds and what was happening to us emotionally, we had that as a shared vocabulary. And I said, what I want you to keep a log of when you do your email is exactly those things. Say when you went online, what was going on for you emotionally, what was happening in your body, what was happening with your breath, and keep track of that. And at the end of a week, look back over your log and then write 1 or 2 pages talking about what you discovered. And every single student discovered by doing this form of mindfulness practice that there were certain things that were happening for them around email that were actually not what they wanted at all. So people often found that they went online when they were feeling anxious or bored, and that they got more anxious when they were online longer. A common experience for me is I just have to look at the inbox of my email inbox, and what do I see there? I see all the things that aren't done. So that's interesting, right? I mean, it doesn't tell you how to solve the problem, but at least tells you that there's some kind of disruption, emotional and maybe even body disruption happening. Another example of what a student discovered, she realized that, and obviously there's no email in that particular box now, but imagine you're looking through your entire inbox, and your eye is just glancing down. Well, think about all the different kinds of things from all the parts of your life that show up in your inbox. So in the course of 10 seconds, you can be in touch with, your partner who wants you to pick up the dry cleaning, a meeting that's been scheduled that actually you don't really want to go to. I mean, you can cover your entire life in a scan of 10 or 15 seconds with all the emotional stuff and all the distracting qualities that come along with that. And so this woman, this student, realized that was in itself disruptive, and she started thinking about how could she better filter and segment so that her entire life wasn't pounding on her every time she looked at her inbox. The larger point is not that any one of these people is going to come up with the ultimate answer to email, but each one of us, if we bring some more thought and reflection to our practices like that, we can actually make some discoveries from ourselves about what's not working and how we could do it better. Okay, just to let you know a little bit about what I've been up to. 4 years ago, I organized a conference on information silence and sanctuary, which was wonderful. I've been lucky enough to get funding from the MacArthur Foundation for these events. Then 2 years ago, while I was at the Library of Congress, I organized a workshop on mindful work and technology. I taught this course on information and contemplation. And in June, I'm organizing another conference that will be at the University of Washington called No Time to Think. If you want to see a little bit more about it, here's the URL for the site, depth.washington.edu/IQL. So part of what I've been trying to do is to bring scholars, researchers, artists, religious leaders together to look at the nature of this problem and to raise consciousness and hopefully to begin to create some kind of larger research agenda. Okay, so I've told you pretty much what I wanted to tell you. Let's go back to the great man himself, the inventor of hypertext. This is the last paragraph of that famous article. The applications of science have built man a well-supplied house and are teaching him to live healthily therein. They have enabled him to throw masses of people against one another with cruel weapons. They may yet allow him truly to encompass the great record. That's a lovely phrase, to encompass the great record, and to grow in the wisdom of race experience. He, man, human beings may perish in conflict before they learn to wield that record for their true good. Yet, in the application of science to the needs and desires of man, it would seem to be a singularly unfortunate stage at which to terminate the process or to lose hope as to the outcome. This is to remind you, this is the vision that Bush had, which is, I think, a vision that in a lot of ways Google has as well, which is to really do good by organizing the record. And the part of it that really, if you want one summary slide, it's this. I think the next challenge ahead, I mean, there's always more to do in organizing the record. But the next challenge is to balance ratio with intellectus, to figure out how we can not only do a brilliant job of searching and researching, abstracting, refining, and concluding, but how we can create the space and time for thinking, for reflection, for contemplation, and to actually assimilate and work with all the information that's available to us today. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? Is that a hand back there? No?
So I'm only learning about you just now and heard about Xerox PARC. And I'm wondering if you would draw any parallels between Bush and Douglas Engelbart. And as I'm just now reviewing Bush's thoughts, I see how he is thinking about helping an individual think and making the tools to help an individual think. And I see Engelbart's focus more on helping communities of people work together. Any thoughts to that? That's right. You're absolutely right. Douglas Engelbart, by the way, who I think there's a picture in the downstairs somewhere of Meng with Engelbart, is another one of the luminaries in this story about the development of hypertext in the web. He at SRI, at the Stanford Research Institute. He developed the first working hypertext system, and in I forget what year it was, 67 or earlier, did this amazing demo with Windows on the screen. He was the inventor of the mouse, by the way. The mouse was not invented at PARC. And you're right. Oh, and by the way, Engelbart read As We May Think, and there's a letter where Engelbart writes to Bush, and it's not clear whether Bush ever responded to him, but Engelbart got really jazzed when he read this article. I think he was in the Navy at the time. But you're right. Bush seems to have had a much more solitary, the individual working with his or her workstation, and Engelbart's vision was of a much more collaborative environment. You're absolutely right. What's also interesting is if you want to look at another one of the roots of the web, H.G. Wells, the historian, had this idea for what he called a world brain. He didn't have a sense, I'm not sure he had a sense of what the technologies would be, but his was an idea of, in a sense, organizing all of world knowledge. Whereas Bush didn't quite have that idea. He had more the person at his own individual workstation, putting links together and so on. So that was a very good point. Yes?
Hi, David. Who's going to dispute you? I mean, serenity, calmness, it's all good stuff, right? But and I thank you for the good words about the Google homepage. At the same time, I'm wondering how we can design spaces that do support contemplation and this sort of sense of peacefulness and so on. And particularly in light of the sort of phenomena of flow and disruption of flow. Because we find that even tiny little decrements in increases in latency or decrements in performance can actually really affect one's ability to do work. And you know very well that, jitter in the response time actually really reduces your ability to engage into a flow state. So the question is, if it's just a matter of slowing down, we'll just give everybody modems and we'll slow everything down. And that's probably not what you want.
No.
So what is the nature of the design of sort of these kinds of places that support this kind of space for thinking?
Dan, I don't actually know the answer to that. I mean, that's the kind of research that actually needs to be done. But I think that what it's going to take is it's going to take park-like experiments, which we both know what that was like for many years. It's going to take experiments where people really do try to build environments and see what happens. Right? I mean, I don't think it's one size does not fit all. There's work. I'm sure you know some of the work. There's work at Microsoft. Eric Horowitz and some of his people have done stuff on how do you minimize interruptions, or how do you develop a model of the user in such a way that you figure out what the right time is. I mean, I think that's interesting work, but I don't think it goes far enough because I think part of what we need is a baseline shared understanding of some of these other states. See, I think so long as we simply import the model of efficient effectiveness, which is this allows me to do this little piece, but we don't take seriously that there is another mode of relating to the world until the designers who are going to design for that are themselves experiencing that. I don't think we're going to get good answers. So we actually need, the work that Meng is doing in bringing Norman Fisher in to get people trained in, not meditation, but emotional intelligence. We need people who are willing to talk with one another about the flow state experiences that they actually achieve, maybe on the hiking trail. And it has to be legitimate to talk about that in relation to what happens in the office. So it's the right question, and I don't have the answer. But I think I see, especially given the kind of background that we share with Park, I think I see how one could begin to actually investigate that kind of thing. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jonas, and I just came from meditation, which I lead on Wednesdays here, and it's a wonderful thing to do. I come from Europe, I come from Sweden, and I live in San Francisco. And I've observed, and it become very clear to me over the years that I miss something, because wherever I am in the city, there's no benches to sit down. I can't sit down and just observe what is. I have to keep moving. If I want to sit down anywhere, I'm probably loitering according to the city law or something. And I really want to have a ticket for loitering in US. I'm trying to get this. I'm not sure how I need to do that. But I think it's a very interesting concept, because if you're sitting down and being quiet and just enjoying life and not running around, you're essentially loitering in this culture, or the American way, maybe in the way I perceive it. I observe that I can't sit down and I can't be calm and quiet without consuming. I can go to a cafe, but it's going to be mostly inside, and I'm going to sit there and I have to consume to stay there. And I'll be bombarded by people consuming, and there's going to be TVs on, and there's always something trying to steal my attention. If I walk on the street, there's going to be people asking me for signatures, and if I'm voting in California, or I don't know. They never asked me if I vote in Sweden. I would like that. But this is a very interesting thing, because it's built into the culture and also into the architecture of cities a lot. And I would be very happy if something could be done to think about these things on a broader scale. And I don't know if you have any suggestions.
Well, first, thank you for those excellent observations. I think it is in some sense built into our culture that that leisure is loitering, or a certain kind of leisure is loitering. The one institution that I think still is carrying some of this other relationship to the world in our culture is libraries. It's so interesting, because here, we all know, look at what's happening on the web, with digital libraries. But at the same time, public libraries are prospering in this country. And in San Francisco built a new one, and Seattle built a beautiful new public library and is retrofitting, the branches and all of that. The library, and especially the reading room, remains a kind of protected space in this culture, and it's a place where people can go. It's not acceptable to use cell phones typically in a place like a reading room. And very often there isn't even wireless there. You might actually be there just to think or to write, or to read a book. So that's the place. I'm excited about, as I think about how do we move these ideas more broadly into the culture, my interest is in targeting public libraries as a space. I mean, they've been hit very hard with, needing to show performance metrics and all those kinds of things, and yet the public wants to have those secular, open, contemplative spaces.
So,
last question.
So I had a pretty similar question. Are there any cultures or countries that you think are better or worse at this kind of contemplative thinking, and what features of the culture would be correlated with that? Maybe like internet use or a lot of car use, or...
That's a really great question, and I don't actually have a good answer to it because I'm not that familiar. I mean, there are countries like, is it Bhutan? That has taken on, which is a Buddhist country, that has taken on a notion of gross national happiness, right? Which presumably, it would be interesting to look at how technology is being used there. I don't know. I think there are cultures that are even more frantic than ours. I mean, I've spent a certain amount of time in Japan. And at least the parts of Japanese culture that I have seen suggest to me where we're going to be 5 to 10 years from now. There's even a term in, I've forgotten, there's a term in Japanese which essentially means death by overwork. I mean, that's how seriously the notion has been taken. But you raise a very, very good question. I mean, it would be wonderful. I mean, put that in the hopper for a kind of research direction that somebody ought to fund, which is to look across cultures at how people are doing in maintaining this other dimension of life. And maybe even, because, I hope it's clear to you, and since I'm wrapping up now, I'll use this as my last sentence or two. I hope it's clear to you that what I'm really saying is we have the opportunity to figure out how to do this with the technologies as well. It's not about pulling the plug, but I think we've been so focused on this more, faster, better, everything has to be faster and more effective and efficient in certain ways, that we've lost sight of the fact that we've cut out an entire dimension that is not only central to who we are as human beings, but that's central for doing creative work. And that's probably the argument that ultimately is going to win, because we want to do creative work and we want to do good work. And I don't see how we can do it adequately when we're running faster than is healthy for us. So I think at that point I will stop and say thank you all.